Welcome to KINE2253, Motor Development Across a Lifespan. This lecture will discuss the fourth chapter of Lifespan Motor Development, the 7th edition by Haywood and Getchell. This lecture will also provide supplementary examples and explanations to help provide a deeper understanding of the book chapter. In Module 2, we will discuss the development of specific motor skills across a lifespan and the factors or constraints that affect their development. Specifically in this lecture, students will examine how prenatal movements serve as a starting point or framework for all subsequent movements. We will discuss how movements during prenatal development and infancy connect the sensory, cognitive, and motor system. We will examine 3 important types of infant movement: spontaneous movements, reflexive movements, and voluntary or goal-directed movements. We will examine the development of motor milestones as they are a way to examine the sequence and timing of early movement patterns. Lastly, we will discuss atypical development and the implications on early infant movements. Let's begin by discussing prenatal movements and how they serve as a foundation for all subsequent movement. In utero fetal movements occur as early as 7 gestational weeks, meaning 7 weeks after conception. Keep in mind that for an infant to be considered a full term, they must be born at 37 to 42 gestational weeks, so these movements are occurring during the late embryological or early fetal phase of prenatal development. These early movements provide a foundation for all future movements. Some of these movements are considered spontaneous movements because they do not seem to be elicited by any type of stimulus or intention. However, in addition to spontaneous movements, the fetus also exhibits reflexive movements, which are in response to specific stimuli. The chart below is from a study by Emil Thiessen, who used 2D ultrasound to visualize infant movement. We can see that the first noticeable movement is sideways bending, which happens around 7 gestational weeks. The next type of movement to develop at 8 weeks include what are called general movements and startle movements. The term general movements may be used because at this point in fetal development, it may be difficult to isolate specific limbs or body parts. At 9 weeks, we see hiccups, isolated arm and leg movements, and sucking or swallowing movements. At 10 weeks, we see breathing movements, stretching movements, hand-to-face movements, jaw opening, head retroflexion, rotation, and anteflexion. At 11 weeks, we see yawning. The last movements to be observed are eye movements, which occur around 14 gestational weeks. In addition to 2D ultrasound, which you can use to see movement, but the images look flat, newer technologies can be used to visualize movement. 3D ultrasound can be used to visualize the fetus, but it is a 3D static picture, so you can only see the infant's body position and body features, but you cannot actually see it move. 4D ultrasound is like a 3D video of the fetus. The 4th dimension is time, so you can basically see what you would in 3D, but in time. Let's look at the different types of ultrasound techniques that are used for prenatal imaging and what types of movements we can observe in the fetus. Here we see a 2D, 3D, and 4D ultrasounds. In 2D, we see the pictures flat, but you can start to see movements like the heartbeat and some leg and arm movements. We can start to see the mouth moving, and we can see the general movements the body has. In 3D ultrasound, you can only see images of the body parts and facial features. Here is an example of a 4D ultrasound. We can start to see the fingers moving and the body moving as if it's in 3D. We can start to see the face movements, mouth movements, and hand-to-face movements. Here we can see foot movements and hand movements, as well as tongue protrusion. We can start to see what looks like breathing movements, potentially sucking movements, As you can see, it's difficult to differentiate the eye movements using ultrasound. Before we move on to infant movements, I want to sum up what we have discussed with respect to prenatal movements. First, many types of spontaneous movements are observed very early during fetal development. These movements will be observed during later development, but we should keep in mind that their origins are in prenatal development. During infancy, which we will discuss shortly, these movements become more intentional and the patterns of the movements become more smooth and efficient. As we have discussed in the first lecture, motor development interacts with many other developing systems, including physical, cognitive, and social affective systems. Although we are particularly interested in the changes in motor behavior across the lifespan and the processes that underlie those changes in behavior, the ability to move and interact in the environment affects physical, cognitive, and social development. For many of us who did not have any movement difficulties and played sports growing up, the interaction among these different systems may seem subtle. For me, my friends were all from my sports teams. Sports taught me about the rules and strategies for my particular sport, and my participation in these sports made me physically stronger. So the development of social, cognitive, and physical dimensions, respectively, are made clear upon reflection. When we think about those with movement difficulties, the interaction among these systems becomes more obvious. The movement difficulties do not allow kids to fully participate at home, at school, or at play. Those individuals may become passive observers who are not able to participate and develop to the same extent as others. Now let's think about infants. They too have difficulties moving. So the infant's ability to interact in the world and begin to develop all of these other systems is dependent on their ability to move. As we will see in the next slides, infants begin to interact with their environment and learn how their bodies move by taking advantage of spontaneous and reflexive movements. Once the infant's brain begins to understand how to move in the environment and gains the strength to move, then voluntary or goal-directed movements will begin to emerge. In this lecture, we will focus on 3 types of infant movements. Spontaneous movements, which are movements that occur without any stimulus or intention. Reflexive movements, which are involuntary movements in response to specific stimuli. And voluntary movements, which are goal-directed, self-initiated movements. The spontaneous movements exhibited in infancy are similar in nature to those exhibited during the prenatal period. The types of spontaneous movements that we observe during infancy are in some ways an extension of what we saw during prenatal development. This includes extending or flexing the limbs or bodies, bending or wiggling the body, moving the fingers and toes, and touching the face and other body parts. Spontaneous movements provide the infant with information about the external world. For example, if the baby is kicking or flexing and extending his or her legs spontaneously, he or she may hit an object in the environment. The spontaneous movements also provide the infant's brain and sensory systems with information about how it feels to move or what it looks like to move. It also provides the brain with information about what activity is necessary to actually generate movement. Now let's explore a few specific examples of spontaneous movements. In this video, we will see an infant produce some spontaneous movements of the fingers, hands, and arms. The infant also shows some spontaneous movements of the toes, feet, and legs.
Our baby today is a 5-day-old infant who, at this point in time, is in an awake, quiet state with eyes open, looking. First thing we want to do is just look at movements and look at the baby's tone. The baby is predominantly in flexion tone, but has spontaneous movements in the upper extremities and also the lower extremities, and is looking around, having some sucking movements. And so the baby's in the quiet, alert state.
Now let's take a closer look at one type of spontaneous movements, supine kicking or walking. When an infant is placed on his or her back, the infant will spontaneously thrust his or her legs. This is called supine kicking. Esther Thielen and colleagues in a series of studies examined the timing and pattern of muscle activity and coordination for supine kicking in infancy. They found that the infants exhibited coordinated patterns of movement at the hip, knee, and ankle, and that spontaneous supine kicking was not actually random movements, but were well synchronized and patterned. Let's look at the movement from flexion to extension, shown here. During flexion, the legs start out in an extended position. The knee and hips flex, and the ankle dorsiflexes. When the knee, hip, and ankle are fully flexed, there is a slight pause before the infant starts to extend. The extension phase begins with knee extension. Then the hip extends, and ankle then plantar flexes, or the toes point down. Interestingly, the timing and positioning is similar to that in adult walking, again suggesting that spontaneous movements may serve as a foundation for much later movements. Although the basic sequence may resemble adult walking, there are big differences between infant supine kicking and adult-like walking movements. First, the timing and sequence of the infant's movements are highly variable. Second, infants typically show co-contraction of the muscles that are used for flexing and extending the legs. This activation pattern is inefficient and inhibits movement. For example, it's hard to extend your legs when your flexor muscles are resisting that movement. Within the first year, infants begin to move their hips, knees, and ankles sequentially, starting with the hip and moving down to the ankle, and they begin to alternate the limb movements. This later pattern is much more similar to that of adult walking. Stereotypies are any spontaneous movements with an underlying temporal structure or movement pattern, like the kicking movements that we just discussed. But there are many other stereotypies that are seen for different body parts. For example, the arms show patterned movements at the elbow, wrist, and hand that are well coordinated. These movements are similar to, but not as rhythmical as, the kicking movements that we just discussed. Finger stereotypies exist such that the fingers flex and extend together. It takes several months before independent finger flexion and extension is observed in the infant. With respect to movements of the head and trunk, head banging and trunk wiggling or squirming are also observed in the infant. There is also rhythmic flexion and extension of the head and trunk, or lateral flexion or extension of the body. Why are spontaneous movements important? First, infants lack the sensory acuity, neural control, and muscle strength to produce intentional, goal-directed movements. Spontaneous movements might allow the infant to exercise the brain, sensory systems, and musculoskeletal system in preparation for voluntary movement. Second, spontaneous movements are patterns of coordination that resemble later movements. They are building blocks for future movements and functions. Reflexes are involuntary movements in response to specific external stimuli. The term infantile simply refers to the fact that the reflexes we will talk about here are only present during infancy. Other reflexes continue into adulthood, like the patella tendon reflex or the withdrawal reflex. There are three types of infantile reflexes: primitive reflexes, postural reactions or reflexes, and locomotor reflexes. Primitive reflexes are involuntary responses to specific stimulation that are mediated by lower brain centers like the spinal cord or brainstem. Reflexes are localized reactions, whereas spontaneous movements are often nonspecific and more general. The same stimulus always elicits the same response. The table here, which is also presented on page 106 of the book, describe the major primitive reflexes. We will describe two of these reflexes in detail, but you will be responsible for knowing all of these reflexes for the chapter quiz. Let's see some of these reflexes in real time. First, let's see an example of the palmar grasp reflex. The palmar grasp reflex is elicited by touching the palm of the infant with a finger or object. The infant responds by closing his or her hands around that object. The reflex is evident from prenatal life to about 4 months of age. If the grasp reflex continues after 1 year, or the reflex is asymmetrical, then this is considered a warning sign of movement or neurological problems. Let's take a look at what this looks like in an infant.
Look at the position of the hand. The hand should be able to open and close, but most of the time it is in a closed state, but not a tight closed state. We can elicit a grasp reflex by again putting the hand right there in the thumb, and again the baby is able to grasp. We can open the hand by stroking the side of the hand, and then just simulating a grasp reflex just by again putting the hand right there and having a grasp reflex. Okay. Now I'm seeing a good grasp reflex there. There's a good grasp reflex there. In fact, you can simulate the grasp reflex and then lift the baby If we can get it quiet there, you can see he's almost pulling himself up as far as the grasp reflex and able to hold on with that.
Now let's see an example of the Mora reflex. The infant starts in a reclined or supine position. The Mora reflex is elicited by shaking the head or briefly moving the infant's head backwards. The infant responds by extending his or her arms or legs, spreading his or her fingers, and then quickly flexing his or her arms after. The Mora reflex is evident from prenatal life to about 3 months of age. The presence of the Mora reflex after 6 months of age, or an asymmetrical reflex, is considered a warning sign of movement or neurological problems.
We can elicit the Mora reflex by having him relax unsuspecting and then give him a sudden stimulus, and there's a good Mora.
In addition to primitive reflexes, infants also exhibit postural reactions or postural reflexes. Postural reflexes help the infant maintain posture in a changing environment. Some of these reflexes help to maintain head position. Some help the infant roll over or turn, and some help to maintain upright body position. The labyrinthian writing reflex is an example of an infant postural reaction. The infant starts in a supported upright position. When the infant is tilted, the head moves such that the infant can maintain upright head position. The infant shows this writing reflex from 2 months to about 12 months of age. Locomotor reflexes are movements that resemble later locomotor patterns. These reflexes can be thought of as moving in place because the infant exhibits the movements but is not actually able to propel his or her body. Typically, these reflexes emerge early and are no longer evident before the onset of voluntary locomotor skill. Examples of this type of reflex are the crawling, stepping, and swimming reflexes. The walking reflex is one example of a locomotor reflex. The infant starts in a supported upright position. When the infant's feet are placed on a flat surface, the infant responds by making alternating stepping movements. The infant shows the stepping reflex from birth to about 5 months of age. As we have discussed and as noted in Table 6.1, infantile reflexes normally emerge and disappear at particular ages. Typical development may be inferred from the timing of the existence and disappearance of different reflexes, although there is some variability in the timing of the reflexes and the size of the response. With time, most of the infantile reflexes can no longer be elicited. Interestingly, most reflexes can be adapted or modified. For example, the sucking reflex may be adapted in terms of speed or pressure to allow the infant to get more milk while feeding. Researchers and theorists have argued the function of reflexes. These arguments can be described in terms of structural, functional, and applied perspectives. The structural perspective suggests that reflexes connect the sensory systems with the nervous system to produce basic movement patterns. Reflexes are simply an outcome of an active sensory motor system. The functional perspective suggests that reflexes are important because they allow the infant to survive. Reflexes are important for eating, breathing, grasping, and positioning or repositioning oneself. For example, reflexes can help the infant position his or herself for birth. The applied perspective suggests that reflexes are actually the building blocks for future movements. Reflexes allow an infant to practice moving. In order to understand the relationship between reflexes and voluntary movements, we need to first examine how constraints affect reflexes. Zalazo, and Kolb performed 2 experiments to understand how exercising the stepping reflex affects the onset of voluntary walking. They found that infants that had practiced the stepping reflex daily during their first 8 weeks of life showed an earlier onset of voluntary walking compared to infants that did not practice the stepping reflex. These authors suggest that the stepping reflex disappears from disuse, and the continual practice of the stepping reflex will prevent it from disappearing. A second set of studies conducted by Thielen and colleagues examined the factors that affect the emergence and disappearance of the step reflex. These authors found that in addition to disuse, other factors could also affect the disappearance of the stepping reflex. For example, if the infant wore ankle weights to mimic the weight increase typical of the first 2 months of life, then the stepping reflex would disappear. Similarly, if an infant no longer shows the stepping reflex, but he or she was placed in water, which would mimic an artificial increase in muscle strength or an artificial decrease in leg weight, the stepping reflex would return. Lastly, these authors also found that if an infant that did not exhibit a stepping reflex were placed on a treadmill, the infant would then exhibit the stepping reflex. Taken together, these studies by Thielen and colleagues suggest that constraints like leg weight, muscle strength, environmental factors play an important role in the appearance and disappearance of these reflexes. Before we move on to our discussion of motor milestones and volitional movement, let's sum up what we have discussed with respect to spontaneous movements and reflexes. First, like spontaneous movements in prenatal development, spontaneous movements are also observed during postnatal infant development. These movements show some similar characteristics as later movements. For example, spontaneous leg movements look like walking, while spontaneous arm movements look like reaching. Second, there are many different types of reflexes that appear and disappear across infancy. Primitive reflexes are important for eating, breathing, and responding to the environment. Postural reflexes are important for maintaining body and head position. Locomotor reflexes allow the infant to begin moving in place and developing some basic patterns that can be used for volitional locomotion. All of these unintentional movements, meaning the spontaneous movements and reflexive movements, serve as a foundation for later goal-directed volitional movements that we will discuss next.